There may be two ways of reading the title of this talk. What did Donald Judd do? Where do is a verb. What action did he take? And the other, what did Donald Judd do? As in, what was his occupation? Judd was known primarily as an artist, but he also worked in architecture and realized many projects, primarily alterations to existing structures, and primarily in Marfa, Texas. I'm assuming many of you, in fact I know many of you have been to Marfa because I've taken some of you there, and are familiar to some extent with Judd's work. But for those of you who have not yet had that pleasure, I'll begin with a very brief overview, and I apologize at the outset for reading much of what follows, but much of this presentation depends on the details, and I don't want to skip over anything. That said, in looking at Judd's work, I think I'm unleashing a host of questions, stated or not, that we can discuss at the end. Okay, you lied, that doesn't work. Okay. Judd was one of a number of artists working in the mid-60s, including Richard Serra, Dan Flavin, Carl Andre, Robert Morris, and others who were loosely collected by critics together under the label minimalists. Primarily sculpture, minimal art tends to consist of single or repeated geometric forms. Industrially produced or built by skilled workers following the artist's instructions, it removes any trace of emotion or intuitive design making. It eliminates the artist's hand. It doesn't refer to anything beyond its literal presence or its existence in the physical world. And this is important. It's big. Materials appear as materials. Color is non-referential. Form is nothing more than form. Allegory is gone. Narrative is gone. Any kind of associated content, gone. By getting the wall... let me go back. Okay. Judd was a critic as well as an artist, and his writings, and later his art, was at the forefront of the movement. Judd and the others were reconsidering the meaning of art in a profound and fundamental way. And the heart of his concern was the role of space in art, which he felt had lingered too long as something merely represented on canvas. Artists implied space in their paintings, and painted space could not be occupied. It was therefore doomed to remain an illusion. It locked out any kind of experiential engagement with the viewer. I'll get this. By getting the art off the wall, onto the floor, and into the space of the gallery, the viewer's relationship with the art was no longer static. Your perception of the art could change as you moved around it. You could argue that perception became the art. Your perception of the art changed as the light changed. In the history of art, this is huge. But consider, space, light, scale, materiality, these guys have swapped their toolbox for ours. They're beginning to trespass into our territory. And Judd did more than trespass, and he did so in more than one way that I'll get to shortly. After Judd moved permanently to Marfa in the late 1970s, space became an increasingly active participant in the execution of his work, just as substantive and present as any physical medium. The interval between objects, the negative space, was considered as much a part of the overall whole as the physical objects themselves, as was the space surrounding the art. In Judd's work, the architectural host was seen not as an empty room waiting to be filled, but as yet another element vital to the completion of the artwork. Here in his 100 boxes of mill aluminum in Marfa, there's an interdependent relationship between the objects and the shed that Judd redesigned to host them. He replaced the garage doors of the original structure with large windows so that light and even the landscape beyond could insinuate themselves into the picture. Conversely, the structure of the shed, the beams and columns, the windows, and the scored grid of the floor helped determine the placement of the art. He creates a symbiotic and reciprocal relationship between the art and the architecture that is vital to our perception of both. It's almost painful to have to gloss over some of this because so much of it could be said, but there's more to get to. Judd, by the way, loathed the two words most frequently used to describe him, which was sculptor and minimalist. Judd thought a sculptor was someone who carved, and he rarely worked stereotomically. And Judd hated the word minimalist because he felt it reduced the work to a style and implied that the reduction of form, characteristic of the work, somehow equaled reduction of content. But the label is stuck. Today, minimalism is a household word. We speak of minimalism in fashion, minimalist graphic design, minimalist food. There are websites and Instagram accounts dedicated solely to minimalism, and of course, there's minimalist architecture. It's important to distinguish between the art and its formally derivative siblings. Minimalism is a particular style in architecture, not a movement with a philosophical agenda. It is an adjective loosely applied to any work that is formally reductive, consistently rectilinear, or starkly detailed. One obvious precursor to this style is this house, which you'll all recognize as Mises Farnsworth House. Judd's artwork and his writing are often cited as other precedents. Stan Allen has called minimalism in architecture a refusal, one that resists the temptations of formal elaboration. In John Pawson's work, shown here, architecture becomes an almost anonymous container, a backdrop that allows for an ephemeral play of light and shadow. This again is another work by Pawson. It's actually his first realized project, an apartment for a London gallery owner named Hester van Rooyen. I'm showing it because she owns a second home in Marfa, and note the Donald Judd artwork in the background. Right. Do I have a cursor? No. Anyway, it's right there in the doorway. Another example, the Pritzker Prize winner Eduardo Soto de Mora, here in collaboration with Alvaro Siza, also a Pritzker winner. Whoops. This is their addition to the Municipal Museum at the Monastery of São Bento in Portugal, and exemplifies minimalism as an architecture of simple and immediately legible forms. Soto de Mora, by the way, originally studied to be a sculptor in art school in Portugal, and claims he changed his major to architecture after a chance meeting with Donald Judd in Zurich. This is Alberto Campabese's Casa Rufo in Toledo, Spain on the left, and his House of the Infinite in Cadiz, Spain on the right. Minimalism seems to have a strong foothold in Spain and Portugal. In the decade or so leading up to his death, Judd found himself working almost as much on architectural projects as he was on his artworks. Most of the architectural projects he was able to realize are remodels of existing buildings intended to house his art, or additions to an existing complex of buildings. With the exception of 2 projects in Switzerland and his own house and studio in New York, all are located in Marfa or just south of town on one of his several ranches. He owned 3. Shown here is a proposal for an insurance company incorporating a public transportation hub on the waterfront in Cleveland that was never built. Another unbuilt design, you might recognize the building in the background as Zumthor's Bergens project. Judd was originally awarded the commission to design the small archive and office building in the foreground, but fell ill before construction documents could be completed. He died of cancer in 1994. So the design went instead to Zumthor. Zumthor, by the way, admired Judd's architectural work. A letter in the Judd Foundation archive reads in part, "Reading your book, Donald Judd Architecture, and being inspired by your work for some time already, I dare ask you, would you mind giving me an opinion on the project whenever you come to Europe?" I've been collecting references to Judd in the writing of contemporary architects, and the list is getting quite long, but that might have to wait for another talk. So I would like to use a small project that I've been researching as a window into a deeper understanding of Judd's architecture. I believe the cabin, which appears in this image, was designed by Judd, although it's a still unacknowledged work. I became aware of the cabin in March of last year, almost exactly a year ago, when this article announcing the formation of a new Texas Parks and Wildlife natural area appeared on the front page of the Big Bend Sentinel. What immediately caught my eye, however, even before I read the story, was the photograph. I remember looking at it and thinking, Judd did that. That there was an obvious and recognizable similarity between the cabin and, for example, the last cluster of his concrete works in Marfa was undeniable. But beyond this formal affinity, and despite the humble scale of the cabin, it communicated intention, an intention that was immediately perceptible. Judd described this immediate, visceral, intuitive apprehension or understanding of a work of art as fast thinking. Fast thinking was, in his words, thinking that's too fast to be thought. It precedes and supersedes rational analysis. In other words, you look at it and you get it. Why you get it when you look at it is something I'll return to in a minute. As I said, the work is unacknowledged. Judd never mentions the cabin in any of his writings, and he wrote at great length. Where's my book? Great length. About his art and architecture, and it doesn't appear in any of the several books that have been written about his architecture. Marion Stockebron, Judd's partner for the last 6 or so years of his life, doesn't remember ever visiting the cabin, and he never took the 2 assistants who worked for him on his architectural projects in the mid-1980s there either. The most compelling piece of evidence we can find that this work can be attributed to Judd comes in a letter written by him to a woman named Philippa Friedrich in 1983, accusing the Friedrichs of plagiarism in the duplication of, quote, my house. In the full context of the letter, it's clear he's referring to the cabin, recently dubbed the San Antonio Cabin by Texas Parks and Wildlife, who now own the property. It's named for the canyon that runs just to the north of it. The Friedrichs were the founding partners of DIA, the arts foundation who funded large-scale projects by artists like Judd, Dan Flavin, Michael Heiser, Nancy Holt, James Turrell, Walter DeMaria, many of what the group of artists that we refer to as land artists right now. These were projects of such scale that they probably could not have been realized without that kind of patronage. Heiner Friedrich visited Judd in Marfa in 1978 with the intention of establishing a permanent collection of Judd's work there. And not long afterwards, as DIA, Heiner and Philippa began purchasing property in and around Marfa for that purpose. These properties became the nucleus of what later became the Chinati Foundation. In 1979, acting privately, the Friedrichs also bought 2 large tracts of land south of Marfa near the border, a ranch known as the Mesquite Ranch, and another good-sized chunk that included the site where the cabin now sits. The Friedrichs later sold a part of this property to the Richard King Mellon Foundation, who in turn transferred the title to TP&W in 1996. This was the property that was to become the new natural area. So, you got all that?
Making notes.
Judd's professional and personal relationship with the Friedrichs quickly went famously and publicly south. And by 1983, at the time the letter to Philippa was written, Judd was working towards securing private ownership of the Chinati properties. Judd's work on the cabin was completed probably in 1979. This is an important and optimistic time in Judd's life. He's newly involved with an incredibly beautiful Italian architect and educator named Loretto Vinciarelli, who shared his passion for architecture. DIA was snatching up property in his name as quickly as he could draw a line around it on a map so that he could realize this permanent collection of his art. And again, this is huge. It's so radical we forget how radical it is. Judd was opposed to the revolving door of art in museums, the fact that art could come and go. He felt there was always a compromise between the art and the space where it was exhibited. The idea that art could be designed for and permanently installed in a space that contributed to, complemented, and possibly even completed the art, as he did with the 100 boxes in mill aluminum, was simply unknown at that time. In Marfa at this time, he was beginning to work more and more in architecture, shaping spaces to house his art, and shaping his art to respond to their host space, possibly in collaboration with Vinciarelli. This photograph is significant for a number of not immediately apparent reasons. First, it is the only photograph on file in the Judd Foundation archive that places Judd at the cabin. It was taken by Judd's assistant, Jamie Deering, probably sometime in 1980. The girl in the foreground is Rainer, Judd's daughter, who would have been 9 or 10 at the time. What I find more significant, however, is that the photo was taken on the porch, because I believe Judd redesigned the structure by adding a wraparound porch to an existing shepherd's cabin. So I was able to visit the cabin, courtesy of TP&W, in July of last year to take measurements so that I could do these drawings. and to do a little bit of on-site investigation. The cabin's built of load-bearing stone wall that was harvested on site. The plan in black on the left represents the original footprint of the cabin. As you can see, it was originally an L with a subtracted porch, the little notch that's cut out there. The kitchen is to the right, and the bedroom with the bath is to the left. It's unclear how the room in the middle was used. There's a bed there now, but with the exception of some shelves that look suspiciously like Judd designed them, there's nothing else to indicate its purpose. On the right, the grayscale area and black columns represent Judd's modifications. That is what Judd did. He added a porch and extended the roof to cover it. Judd did not, however, approach the porch as an architect would, thinking first of orientation and heat gain, whereby the self-shading north side would probably have been left exposed, but as an artist might, wrapping the existing cabin with a pure volume of flat roof space reasonably divided by intentionally placed columns. The house itself, as you can see, is obscured in shadow. By placing the columns at the periphery of the slab in the light, the cabin's formal aspect is quite literally foregrounded. The cabin becomes instead legible as a work, one that shares certain spatial attributes with Judd's other works, both 2- and 3-dimensional. And by the way, the fascia board is not original to Judd's design. Texas Parks and Wildlife replaced it several years ago. Because so much of what Judd wrote and drew has been published, and because Judd often notated his sketches with the date and place where he was working, it's possible to reconstruct a chronology of his many overlapping projects. Judd's drawings in particular reveal a surprisingly prolific and dexterous design mentality that was able to shift from project to project and from art to architecture with an agility that seems to betray the existence of a line drawn between the two. In his writing, however, the line Judd draws between art and architecture is one of difference, and it is, at first, seemingly sharp, precise, and in Judd's words, fundamental. The intent of art, he says, is different from that of architecture, which must be functional. Judd's approach to his art and architecture projects were, however, in many ways more similar than not. They share a concern with materiality, proportion, and, again, space. Judd, in fact, called space my main concern, and his process, whether in artwork or architecture, almost without exception, begins with the definition of space, by specifying the dimensions of a canvas, the volume of an object, or by enclosing a site with the erection of a perimeter wall. Once defined, space becomes, in Judd's mind, almost physical, and then can be simply and non-hierarchically partitioned. These are all operatives gleaned from his writings. Space can be cut, separated, surrounded, doubled, quartered, divided, subdivided, repeated. Objects can be arranged, aligned, and centered in space. Objects can enclose space. Space is quite literally Judd's blank canvas, awaiting his art or architecture to render it visible. This consistent engagement with the material fact of space, regardless of whether the project was an artwork or architectural project, undoubtedly contributed to the ease with which Judd was able to change disciplinary hats. That the process is generative and not limited to his 2-dimensional work is best illustrated here in the comparison of one of his characteristic woodblock prints on the right with his site layout for a complex of concrete buildings at Chinati that were never built. Whoops, did it again. Stop it. There. Okay. Marianne Stockbrun, Judd's partner, who was also the director of the Chinati Foundation for, I think, 15 years after his death, called this project the most uncompromising version of Judd's architecture. And I think it's significant, therefore, for what it reveals about one of the few proposals he did for a freestanding architectural work. Major and minor grids, defined by lines and blocks of color, elucidate a proportional logic in the division of space in the woodblock print. Judd explicitly describes the use of a similar a priori strategy in the design of the complex of buildings. Quote, "The 10 buildings are centered on 10 squares of 12, the 2 in the middle remaining empty. Narrow walks on a grid determined by the doors of the buildings connect them all, making two grids, one major but not linear, and one minor but linear. The grids, in other words, here predetermine the disposition of objects in space. They define the plan, the primary purpose of which here is to collect the work's parts into a recognizable and meaningful whole. The location of architectural elements, doors and walks, implicitly ensure the legibility of the spatial scaffold, underpinning the work even if the lines themselves are absent. So I want to return briefly to Judd's concept of fast thinking because it underscores the interdependence of space and proportion in his work and in his process. Space and proportion are to Judd one and the same, simultaneously the means and the ends, and the end for achieving the visible reasonableness so crucial to Judd in his work. They ensure the immediate apprehension of the work. Judd believed that we could see those numbers, that we could instantly and intuitively sense their presence. They made his intention obvious. As Richard Schiff, art historian who actually works just across campus, has said, what these proportional ratios actually provided or facilitated is the crux. To put it Judd's way, the numbers produced space to be lived. They brought sensory, intellectual experience into the present and held it there. Using simple ratios directly and obviously, Judd avoided the indirectness, the formal indirectness that he understood as having undermined so much contemporary practice. And you have to remember that Judd is practicing writing at this time at the height of postmodernism, and he was violently opposed to the work of a lot of architects who were privileging form over function at that time, and to the associative quality of the forms that they were creating. The underlying similarity between the concrete buildings, the wood block print, and that of the cabin is striking and proportionally consistent. After Judd's modifications, the overall footprint of the cabin measures 44 by 66 feet, a ratio of 2 to 3 that Judd favored. The height to the underside of the roof is roughly 1/2 the interval between the two columns, a ratio of 1 to 2 that he also repeatedly used. The width of the porch, indicated in yellow, is 8 feet, or just about double that of the porch notch cut out from the original plan. Lines struck through the center of the windows on the west side, seen here in black, establish a module of 14 feet 8 inches, which, when tripled, totals 44 feet. While the porch columns are evenly spaced to 22 feet apart, 1/2 of that 44-foot width. As he did in much of his architecture, Judd here extracts the logic inherent in an existing structure and using it as the basis for a new intervention renders it visible. He followed a quite similar process in the redesign of a former hotel at Eicholder in Switzerland in 1989. There he likewise enlarged the footprint of the structure, in this case a terrace, not a porch, using proportions derived from the existing building. In his own words, there will be a granite terrace around the building, 2/3 of the width of the building, except at the front, which will be 1/2. A low granite balustrade, 50 by 50 centimeters, out 1/2 the width of the building from the building, will divide the terrace. 1/2 the width of the building, marked by a solid line of green granite, 50 by 50 centimeters, will be superimposed on a broad plane of gray granite, 2/3 of the width of the building. And if you didn't get that, I didn't get it either. But Judd got it, and I mean, it's like it's all right here, right? So, I mean, what's interesting is that the proportions precede the design in a way, they generate the design. Although Judd had little architectural experience under his belt at the time he was commissioned to redesign the cabin, he was able to forego the formal temerity that characterizes many gestational architectural projects and produce a mature work because he was building on principles and following a process he had long honed in his artwork. The cabin is not a formative exercise, but a fully realized work. Flash forwarding 5 years from the date of the cabin's completion to projects such as those at Eicholder and the concrete buildings, we see Judd implementing many of the same principles and strategies in their design as he did with the cabin. Conversely, we can find evidence supporting the provenance of the cabin in their shared genetic code, the grids, the proportions, and the process that ensured their legibility. So I don't think I mentioned, but there are 3 other cabins existing right now on the Texas Parks and Wildlife site that were built later by the Friedrichs. And I want to return to these, I want to look at these briefly because I think we can find evidence in them for the difference for Judd between what is mere building and what constitutes architecture. But it requires a very brief detour. In its refusal of gesture or authorial signature in the absence of the artist's literal touch, Judd's artwork, and that of many of the other minimalist artists, occasionally suffered for the seeming effortlessness of its conception and birth. I could do that was the all too dismissive reaction of a public not alert to the radical underpinnings of the movement or to the nuances that contributed to the success of a piece. In 1989, Judd famously brought suit against an Italian collector, Count Giuseppe Panza di Guglielmo, for fabricating a Judd piece without Judd's input or authorization, using a simple sketch by Judd that he had purchased on the open market. The story is of interest for what it reveals about where Judd locates the quote-unquote art in the artwork. Judd wrote, "The galvanized surface of the unauthorized work was very different from the first, very soft and delicate. The widths of the panels at the corners and ends were different because the room was different and because Panza never asked about those important decisions. Since to Panza the shape only has to get off the paper, the nature of the material and the surface and the details of construction are all irrelevant. Panza does not even bother to inform himself of the intervals between the parts, which were wrong in the floor plywood works which he made. We got to a great deal of trouble to get a certain kind of plywood, and the details of construction are so unusual that the carpentry has become unique, but Panza doesn't care. What I require is too expensive. Consequently, Panza makes mock-ups, fakes." In a personal letter to Panza, Judd is even more explicit. "The technology and craftsmanship of my work is part of the work. Work made without my supervision is not my work." Judd's cabin is deceptively simple. Thus, it's not surprising that the Friedrichs thought it could be easily replicated and modified without compromising its architectural integrity. And we're assuming here that they were aware of the possibility that it had an architectural integrity to compromise in the first place. The difference between true art and the quote fake, in other words, is in the details. Here, the surface, materiality, the construction, the interval, and the relationship of the work to its host site, those were the things that Panza was guilty of. I wondered if it was possible to locate the architecture in Judd's cabin by likewise comparing it to the Friedrichs' knockoffs. Can we separate Judd's architecture from mere building by peering into the divide between the original and the copy? That much of the work built in the 1980s and early 1990s failed to meet Judd's criteria necessary for a building to claim status as architecture is clear in a statement again taken in his letter to Panza. "Architecture," he says, "today is not comprehensible, it is not spatial, and is not even functional," implying, of course, that true architecture must be all 3. So a close examination of the later cabins almost immediately reveals that beyond a certain geometric purity and a similar material palette, the proportional logic that characterizes the San Antonio cabin and gives it its comprehensibility is almost completely absent. The Friedrichs seem to have simply appropriated certain dimensions from the San Antonio cabin, the 8-foot wide porch, for example, and applied them indiscriminately to these new constructions without recognizing that they were derived from and tied back to the original structure. That there is a superficially similar division of space along proportional lines, and the axial symmetry that Judd favored can't be denied. Judd's love of quartered squares is certainly apparent, but a holistic and recognizable identity of organizational structure based on proportional relationships is absent. The cabins do not cohere. In the letter Judd wrote to Philippa, he demotes them to the status of, quote, hokey buildings, well shy of architecture. And that, it would seem, is the end of the story. I like research. I've always enjoyed trying to solve a mystery, putting together the pieces of the puzzle. But I've always also been interested in the stories that objects can tell, and buildings are nothing if not very large objects that can host a host of stories over time. What events they were witness to, Who designed them, what they were thinking, how they reflect the concerns of a particular society or culture, who constructed them, and of what. And so I'd like to close the book on Judd's chapter for a moment and flash backward to consider the cabin before Judd made it, quote, architecture, and then flash forward a little to talk about how the cabin has become something of a political hot potato in the wake of Judd's legacy. The cabin sits less than 7 miles as the crow flies from the Mexican border. Those of you who have visited the area know how absolutely desolate and hostile the landscape can be. Everything there is pointy and seems designed to inflict pain. Cacti have thorns, snakes have fangs, even the rocks, unlike the nice, smooth, rounded stones of the Appalachians where I grew up, are brittle and sharp. Far West Texas was shaped by volcanic action. It's violent and immediate, and the rocks hurt. You know, too, that the border here is very porous, literally fluid, and that the people who have grown up along it view it very differently from the bureaucrats far removed from it in Washington, D.C. For decades, people on both sides crossed it effortlessly to work, to visit family, to shop, even to attend school. My daughter first visited Mexico when she was 11 or so by wading across the Rio Grande with her best friends so they could have their picture taken on the other side. I wasn't a completely derelict parent. It was no more than ankle deep. Although I suppose I did encourage her to break international law. My favorite unofficial crossing was located in Candelaria, about a half an hour or so north of the cabin, where someone had laid an old truck chassis across the river and nailed a few boards to it. There was no proper road on the Mexican side, and cows roamed freely up to the water's edge. I'm quite sure that the bridge was used for passage of drugs because on more than one occasion I saw trucks with no license plates parked in the field on the other side with their engines running. This was, of course, prior to 9/11, after which time the bridge was removed. A healthy percent of the population of Marfans today are descendants of refugees who crossed the border in advance of Pancho Villa's army during the Mexican Revolution in the early 1900s. The cabin would have been built to house shepherds, legal and illegal, who were employed by the large ranchers, and to watch the sheep, and to house workers, largely illegal, who helped with the annual sheep shooting. You can barely make out the names of some of the workers who originally constructed the cabin here on a concrete plaque that was oddly cast on the back of the lone freestanding column that originally held up 1/4 of the porch roof. They're even numbered. There are 10 of them. And given the prevalence of backward-facing S's, most of the workers were probably barely literate. But they left their mark. We know who built the cabin. The Friedrichs retained ownership of part of their original ranch land, and in researching the cabin, I met with a man who was still in their employ and had helped with Judd's reconstruction. He told us stories of how the workers would sleep in tents while they were building the other 3 cabins so they could easily and quite literally pull up stakes to relocate if the Border Patrol appeared on site. And although there may have been as many 60 men working on construction of the cabins, on the other 3, at any one time, they rarely worked together as a group so that they wouldn't all go down at once if the Border Patrol dropped by. As I mentioned, the cabin is named for the canyon that runs behind it, San Antonio. That canyon and others like it are used as highways for immigrants crossing illegally into the U.S. trying to make their way north. Unless you've had the opportunity to spend any time off-road in the area, you can't possibly imagine just how desperate they must be to even attempt moving through this landscape on foot. I was thirsty and terrified just wandering around the property within sight of the cabin. The government has laid ground sensors along the canyon so they can track foot traffic in the area, and interestingly, Texas Parks and Wildlife leaves the cabin unlocked so that it can be used as a shelter, not out of any sanctioned empathy on their part, but to protect the property. No one is going to break down a door or kick open a window if it's already open. On the day that I was there, there were 2 Border Patrol helicopters attempting to land along an arroyo, and several Border Patrol SUVs, obviously trying to apprehend somebody. By the way, it was in analyzing historic aerials like this that I was able to determine when the cabin was originally built. Oops. And it was sometime between 1972, or sometime between 1970, when it does not appear on the first aerial, in 1984, when it obviously does. So returning to this very important photograph again, Judd sits with his back to the house, looking out toward the hills beyond. He turns toward the landscape. I think he also has a nosebleed or maybe a cold because he's holding a handkerchief up to his nose. This is probably the orientation any visitor would assume. Certainly the unidentified guest beyond Judd sits looking in the same direction, also holding his hand in the same position, but pensively, I don't think he has a nosebleed. But the posture is suggestive. Judd was ardent in his adoration of the land and in his defense of the environment. He stated not just once, but several times, in talks and in writing, that virgin land should be preserved, and asserted, "I've never built anything on new land." I mentioned that his break with the Friedrichs was famously antagonistic, and their alleged plagiarism certainly contributed to the rift. But it was the damage they caused to the land and the construction of the other 3 cabins that I think pushed Judd over the edge. And I believe this is why he never visited the cabin again or acknowledged it in his writing. In the letter, the transgression the Friedrichs were most guilty of is clear, and you can read it in the top quote, which was taken from the letter to Philippa written in 1983. Not one to let sleeping dogs lie. Later, in 1987, he wrote, "Here, everywhere, the destruction of new land is a brutality. Nearby, a man bought a nearly untouched ranch 3 or 4 years ago, bulldozed roads everywhere so he could shoot deer without walking, and last fall he died." You can practically hear Judd chuckling when he wrote this. In another direction, a pair cut their land to pieces for no reason at all. Within a real view of the world and the universe, this violence would be a sin. I believe the pair he was referring to was the Friedrichs. Judd repeatedly authored rules governing architecture and refined them over time. In September of 1990, he wrote, "Order of importance, 1, preservation of land." Again on the 28th of November, 1990, rules of importance. 1, preservation of the land, don't build. The other 3 cabins were built on disturbed land, violating this rule. So back to the photograph one more time. I mentioned earlier that it was taken by Judd's assistant, Jamie Deering, and I asked Jamie what he remembered about the day the photograph was taken, whether Judd was happy with the result. I was wondering if Judd had written the cabin out of his portfolio because it wasn't built the way he had imagined. Judd apparently didn't do any on-site supervision. Jamie replied, quote, "The day Donald and the kids and I went to inspect his house, he seemed pleased. I assumed everything done up there, up to that point, was his. And then he added something far more interesting. He wrote, I remember Judd saying something like, 'This should teach them how to live.' Not said as an insult, but as a genuine expression of hope." I mean, think about it. That's a big statement, and it speaks volumes about the ethical role Judd assigned to architecture and the importance he placed on architecture in life. The cabin was Judd's statement in stone, the physical expression of the many rules governing architecture that he would later formalize in writing. Conflicting ethical, political, and familial priorities made researching the cabin challenging at times. Buildings can be blessed or cursed by the long shadow cast by the architect that designs them, and that's certainly the case with the cabin. I understand that nearby landowners are concerned that opening up the parkland where the cabin sits to the general public will compromise their privacy and security. And if TP&W uses the cabin in Judd's name as a draw to promote the park, as it proposed doing in the article I showed earlier, that concern could become a serious reality. It's certainly one shared by Judd's children, Rainer and Flavin, who are co-presidents of the Judd Foundation, the agency that manages his properties in Marfa and controls access to his archive. A new park will certainly require new infrastructure, roads, utilities, parking, furthering the desecration of the land. It's up to the foundation to formally recognize the provenance of the cabin, and I doubt for this reason any such blessing will be forthcoming. And in the meantime, the cabin is stuck in a kind of architectural purgatory, and it's deteriorating. So just throwing this up at last, this is a very brief list of some of Judd's rules for architecture. Anyway, I'll just leave those up for consumption and conversation. It's nice we have a soundtrack.
Wondering if I should wait for everyone to read it or just applaud? Thank you.
So we have some time for questions.
I guess that's, what do you think was Judd's claim to authority? He spoke authoritatively. Architecture should, art should. Where was the should coming from?
You know, he was one of his generation of artists, they say, was probably the best educated generation. A lot of them had gone to college on the GI Bill after being in the war. And I mean, he had a pretty remarkable education. He had a degree in philosophy from Columbia, degree in art history. So he was, and then he wrote quite a lot as a critic. And I think that background, at least in part, gave him the foundation to make some of the assertions he did. He also, I mean, he lived in New York. He went to openings. He was friends with other artists. They talked all the time. They collaborated all the time. And I think he's kind of, in his writing, he's building an argument for a new kind of art in his criticism, even before he starts actually making art. And I think he was doing the same thing with his architecture.
So it's very normative. It's very,
Yeah,
this is how it shall be.
yes, right.
Yeah, you can see it right there. Right.
I think he was also from the Midwest.
Okay.
From what I understand, he was a very black and white person. There was no middle ground. There was no gray. When he broke with people, he broke with them completely.
You can see why he chose Marfa, because Marfa seems to already be a place that is definitive and yeah, it's a strong move in the first place. Yeah.
That one design that you said that was never built, the courtyard scheme. Has there ever been talks about building that, or has it ever been
The one with the
considered?
concrete buildings, the one I showed with the wood block. I think Chinati hopes to build it at some point. There are pieces of it that were built, but this is where Judd the artist and Judd the architect kind of like butt heads. He wanted the shells to be impossibly thin, and they failed. Like if you go there now, there are struts actually holding them up, right? But I think there have been advances made in concrete, construction since that time. And Chinati, there are rumors that they're gonna do a capital campaign so that they can finally build these.
And what was to be in those sheds? His art?
His art.
Other people's art?
His art. Some of the the freestanding stainless works that I showed earlier.
So the
Or
Flavin
stored in
was his friend,
Yeah.
and he knew that Flavin's work was going to go in there?
Yeah.
Or was that going to be his own, more of his own?
No, it was always intended to be Flavin's.
Son is named
So it's on Slavin.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
I mean, bravo. So it's a really lovely piece of research. I'm convinced. That's nice to see. I'm just gonna ask you, if you've been to the thing itself, and it's been
The cabin.
Yeah, you did the drawings. It's interesting to look at your drawings and just to see no slope on the roof. Is that actually how it's built?
There is slope of the roof. It's probably
You
just
can
because
see
of the
it's like, yeah.
You can just barely see it.
Oh, by the way, here I can show you this. This is a list of good architects and bad architects. You notice on the good side we have two writers, Louis Mumford and Michael Benedict, right?
Well done.
There you go.
He needs no more authority than that.
That's why you get authority, Michael.
I really wish Judd had died when he did. I would love to see who else was included on this list, because I think there are people who have kind of picked up the minimalist mantle, actually building on the precepts of minimalist art, who are practicing right now. But he was absolutely scathing in his condemnation of the people on the list on the right side. So let's see if we can go back. He liked Philip Johnson. He thought he was amiable, but a whore. Well, Johnson himself said he was a horse, so. There's a very slight slope to the roof.
One section shows a kind of a
It's like
butterfly.
right there.
No, that's the ground.
That's the ground.
Oh, sorry, shit, I'm looking this way, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm
There's a
sorry, I
slight
didn't
slope
do
on it,
these
yeah.
for presentation, I did them for me, and then but, yeah.
So the porch is an extension of the existing roof?
They replaced the roof.
That's it.
But it
When they added the porch, they tore off the
they tore off
existing
the-
roof and the round vigas, they had round roof beams, roof rafters, and replaced them with.
And how did you do the eaves? Because the rafters hit the beam
And they
come
go
out
through.
the other side.
Yeah.
Do you know how he did that?
They blocked up with
Are they
their
notched
stone.
or are they?
They
I mean,
they
with-
sit right on top of the wall, and then he blocked with rock
Just
between
net.
them, between the rafters.
No, I'm talking about on the porch itself.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
He's saying that he says the outrigger is continuous with the.
Yeah, one of them.
If there were any rain in this part of the world, it would not hold up.
No.
Well,
like,
that's
if
probably
you look
why they
along-
replaced the
Yeah.
fascia.
Oh, past the.
Yeah.
You see how they go through the
Probably
beam?
nailed on the deck holds it down.
Yeah.
Yeah, the deck's holding up.
Probably
Yeah.
most likely, in there, toenail down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I don't think a real architect would do that.
No.
We do it all the time, Michael.
No. Hang those outriggers on the deck.
And the plaque, that's something. The plaque you're saying was the people who built the Judd version.
No, they were
Oh,
the
the
people
original.
that built the original Shepherd's Cabin. Yeah.
What was the reasoning again that you thought that he wasn't taking credit for the design? What were the reasons potentially behind that?
I think his split with the people that own the property was so acrimonious, he just didn't, he never went back there. I mean, it is kind of curious because he did acknowledge other artworks where his relationship with the patron wasn't exactly friendly, right? But I think it was just such a negative experience for him that he never went back there, even though he's literally, like, here's the cabin, right? If you literally, like, did that, jumped over that hill, his ranch is on the backside of that hill. This is Chinati Mountain, and he's buried there. But, to my knowledge, he never went back to the cabin.
So no one's credited with that redesign of the cabin.
No. And I wish I am forbidden by the Judd Foundation to quote from other parts of the letter. They're very concerned with Judd, with the narrative that comes out, right? These are his kids, they're very, they don't want to cast any more of a negative light on their father, I don't think, than he has already cast on himself with his own writing. But the letter's almost humorous in its negative wording, let's say, and what he accuses them of. He apparently he didn't know that they had built the other three cabins. He found that he was good friends with the pilot. The pilot would take him out all the time. And they found them flying over. They flew over the ranch one day, and he was appalled by what they had done to the land. You know, that they had torn it up to build these new cabins. They put in new roads. There were swales. And the Friedrichs are, they're Sufi Muslims. And they were using these cabins, they were bringing people in for Muslim holidays and letting them stay in the cabins. And so they really did kind of tear up the ranch land that the Friedrichs, they still own it. There's actually a little Muslim chapel there. It's not a chapel, it's a mosque.
Could you go back to the bit that you quoted from the letter, just about what he, at the very beginning, what he was accusing them of?
He accuses them of plagiarism.
But he doesn't refer to his own. What are the tanks?
All right, so every cabin has a tank, you know, raised water structure, and a little shade pavilion adjacent to it. and there's one behind the cabin, the San Antonio cabin, and it's interesting, it is 22 feet square. So he took the module from the cabin and used it to create the footprint of the shade structure. And because to him that was another way of allowing for this correspondence, right? But at the other cabins, they're also 22 feet. So again, it's another instance where the Friedrichs just kind of went, oh, he did a 22-foot structure. They plopped it down without recognizing that there
Right.
was that correspondence.
What would be the headquarters?
The headquarters is the property that the Friedrichs still own. And I think what they did there, and I'm not sure, I was able to visit that too. That's where I interviewed the guy who had worked on it. They replicated a lot of his furniture.
That's it.
Yeah.
So it's when he's saying you plagiarized, he's not referring to the cabins, he's referring to or maybe the pavilions of the cabin.
He's referring to the cabins and the
The whole
tanks.
kit.
Yeah, the whole thing.
Everything.
So I'll say one more thing. I find very interesting that his interest in numbers. Because we don't do that very much. I would say it's a number of mysticism, but it's like I could not see a teacher or a student saying, "This is 22 feet." Like that. And that's 2 11s. Because like we 5'3", 5'6", I don't know, wide enough. That's what that's our sense of dimension. Like we don't have a sort of there's 4 of them. Oh my goodness, 4. Like we just don't do that. And and Khan did. Khan was very, very. He said he liked Khan. He was very specific about that. If you do 8 of something, or like 8 was different to 10. It was just different to 10. Do anything with 8, and it's going to come out different to doing, quote unquote, the same thing with 10. So it's not exactly Platonism or number mysticism. It's just that on the small numbers between 2 and 8, which are countable immediately. I mean, there's a process called supertizing, and supertizing is your ability to count the number of things you can see instantly. And it's a skill that fades away at around 7. Like after 7, we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, a whole bunch. Just like our ability to do that. So Khan would always make his buildings out of numbers that you could see instantly. You'd see a 4, you'd see a 3, or an 8, maximum 8. Because after that it gets too many. So like you would never make a building out of thousands of components.
Right.
Because you couldn't count them. So the ability to like jump on a building and immediately start counting. 4 blocks. Each block has 4 windows. Each window is divided into 3. So you're always able to go 3, 4, 5, 5, 3, 10, like this. I see him doing the same, and like really adoring dimensionality and numerology in a way.
Well, what he was doing, what I didn't mention, was the minimalists in general. One thing they were trying to exorcise from art was any sense of composition and hierarchy, right? Because again, that held the artist kind of hand, right? And it implied that the whole was composed of pieces rather than a whole of pieces, if that makes sense.
Very good, yeah.
So for Judd, the use of the numbers, the use of the grid, the use of proportion was one way of establishing order without relying on composition.
Because the numbers work.
The numbers were, yeah.
Yeah.
And it ensured that kind of immediate legibility that he thought was so important. It was important that you could see a work and understand the thought that went into it. But that thought couldn't be designed.
Yeah.
Design was again one of those things you couldn't, it was the evil.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It kind of seems to me that if Donald Judd were to just describe the type of work he makes, it would probably be pretty similar in vocabulary and language to the definition of minimalism. And so I wonder if you think he just was stubborn about disliking the word minimalism, and if it applied the same way for him. with his buildings as it did with his artworks?
I don't know about the latter. That's something I'm kind of interested in. I'm trying to find out right now what kind of architect we would think Judd was. You know, there's a lot of stuff that he's doing that we would call classicism. He loved symmetry, he loved axes, he loved these proportions, right? And a lot of that stuff we wrote out with modernism. But he hated the word minimalism just because he thought it was reductive.
But Judy, all artists hate all labels of work.
But
There's
this,
a constant war between the artists and the critics.
yeah,
They will not take a label,
Yeah.
ever.
But I think part of it
Maybe it's
is the
that.
distinction between style and sensibility, and that he maybe regarded minimalism as a sensibility. The artists that he writes about, Oldenburg, John Chamberlain, that he's very fond of, none of them are minimal, but they share a sensibility. And Barbara Redd said the same thing
exactly.
when she wrote about Donald Judd. So I think it's more about putting it in a box,
Yeah.
putting him in a box and reducing it to experience.
That's exactly right. You know, the fact that these people were actually working, there was a similar underlying sympathy, let's say, but they were working in very different materials at different scales, and yet they were all kind of lumped together, right? For expediency, so that they could, and that's the other thing, you know, once you put a name on something, it's easy to dismiss it or, you know,
Yeah.
accept it.
I remember
right?
Charles Moore claiming he wasn't a postmodernist. He hated it.
What did he think he was?
An architect. He's just they just don't want it.
He's not on the list. Oh wait, no, that's not true. He is on the list. Judd loathed the Piazza d'Italia.
I'm sure.
Loathed it. Yeah.
Well, Judy, I want to say thank you for a great talk.